To remain updated with the latest business news, click on the bell icon.
Well, we are awaiting the presentation of the Union Budget by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman sometime from now. But joining right in is a very special guest with me. I'm joined by Dr. Arvind Virmani, the former CEA and also Chairman, the Policy Foundation. Dr. Virmani, thank you so much for taking out time for us. First up, I want to understand from you what kind of growth framework do you expect from the upcoming budget this time?
So yes, that is the first place to start is the growth. And the way I would put it, I think, is to think of it in two parts. One was the recovery from the pandemic collapse of FY20 to FY21, and then how well and how quickly one goes on the growth path from FY22. So we have been saying, and I think the government's projections are consistent with this, and let me quickly explain how. What we have been saying is that after the pandemic year of FY20, the GDP would recover to above the FY19 level by 1 to 3%. So let's say a mean of 2%. And after that, because of the reforms that were done during the pandemic year, the growth rate would be on a path of 7.5%, again, with some plus minus so on. So if you look at the 2 years together, that adds up to a simple average of 17.5% growth. Now, if you look at the 8 to 8.5 number of the economic survey for next year and the 9.2 number, of course, they accept the NAS numbers, which they have to, that's the official number. So if you add those two up, you get exactly what we have said. It's 17.2% to 17.8% real growth in GDP. And our number, if you add up the two, which I have been giving for the last 15 months, comes to 17.5. So it's right in the middle of the range they have given. So that is how I would view it. So in that context, on top of 9.2, 8 to 8.5% to me sounds very reasonable because it's consistent with my own projections.
But also help us understand what should be the spending priorities in Budget 2022.
So, one has to be very careful. There are two aspects of the fisc, you can look at it from different views. Let me start with the revenue. If you look at the revenue expansion, you can look at it from the angle of saying that the economic recovery is there, plus the extra tax rates which the government may have imposed on oil, for example. But let's leave that aside for a second. Otherwise, you look at revenue rise as an indicator of the recovery. It's not that the revenue rise led to the recovery, but the recovery led to the rise in revenues. That is how I would look at it. Secondly, on the expenditure side, certainly, I think the way I would look at those is that they were targeted expenditures designed to make sure that those at the lower end of the scale, particularly the food subsidy, which I think has been very, very important. We are actually doing some research on it, which hopefully, unfortunately, it won't be available for the budget, but which will show how important it was. So, but what stimulates the economy, which contributes to the growth, is the overall fiscal expansion or deficit. So that actually has been reasonable. It is not that it's of course higher than it was before the pandemic and has contributed to the growth recovery, but it's not really that much that it's the major source of the recovery. I think the recovery is broad-based with investment recovery, the export expansion, and to a lesser extent and a bit of a concern, the recovery in private expenditures. So, and then, okay, so that's a pass. So how do we see going forward? I think part of the reason why the expenditures have actually not expanded that quickly in consonance with the revenue is because during the pandemic, it's very difficult to spend, because the pandemic fears, the problems of contagion, etc., also constrained government's expenditure programs. It announced a big capital budget in the last budget in terms of infrastructure. Some of those have not actually progressed as fast as one had expected or hoped for in the last budget. So I think more important, I think there will be a step up in the capital expenditures to some extent, but more important will be the steps to make sure that whatever extra capital expenditures, especially in construction intensive infrastructure, which will play a very important role even for the next year, actually takes place.
But help me understand on the fiscal front, should the government cut the fiscal deficit or keep consolidation for later?
So that's a very good question. I would look at it two ways. Once, as the economic survey last year very clearly showed, that the best way to reduce the debt GDP ratio, which has definitely ballooned in the pandemic, mainly because of the collapse of tax revenue in the pandemic year. As you pointed out earlier just now, the revenues have, of course, recovered in the current, after the pandemic year. But in the pandemic year, the debt ratio went up a lot. And as the economic survey showed, and as our study of globally shows, that the best way to reduce the debt GDP ratio is to accelerate the rate of growth. So from that perspective, I think it's very important that the quality of expenditures be focused on, which is focus on those expenditures even for the next year. I think it was very important in the current year, but I think it's going to remain important for the forthcoming year, to focus on those with high labor intensity and high multipliers. Okay, all this stuff has been talked about before, but I think it's important to repeat it. So really the quality of the expenditures in terms of its multiplier effect and how quickly it generates employment, at least in the next 6 months, I think is what to be focused on. And thirdly, the growth rate. As I said, the growth is what will bring the actual GDP, the debt GDP ratio down. I think the absolute size of the fiscal deficit is less important, but despite that, I think broadly the restraint on the fisc will remain. I don't think there'll be a big expansion. I don't think there'll be a contraction. It will be kind of go on as far as the intentions of the government is concerned, more or less at the steady level.
But what about jobs? Help us understand, is there merit in the demand for an urban Narega kind of a scheme?
Okay, another good controversial question. So here is my thinking and view on this. I think we have to be very careful about the temporary effects associated with the pandemic, which is a very special. It's like a once in a century shock which has happened, and we should not generalize too much. It's not reflected of the normal economic shocks that we have faced, let's say over the last 50 years, or are likely. Of course, there could be climate shocks, etc. But leaving that aside, the normal economic shocks, I think the issue with the pandemic was that, and this we said, and nobody believed us. We've been saying, because we've done the research on pandemics, we said that it's more of a problem in urban areas, because the virus, because it spreads through the air, it spreads through close contact, and these situations arise more in the urban areas. The pandemic will spread faster than the pandemic in the urban areas and will have more negative effects. We've been saying this for a year or year and a half, but nobody kind of believed us. So the conditions are special. The severe effect on urban employment is due to this very special factor. Now, I think it would be a mistake to overplay that. Of course, there will be some situations where we have some new epidemics, but this is not the problem in general with every shock. So I think some attention needs to be paid to that, but overdoing it, I think, would be a mistake.
But let's talk subsidies. What about the food and the fertilizer subsidies? This year, we understand the spend is going to be 1.5 lakh crores over the budgeted estimate.
So I think food and fertilizer are very separate issues for the same reason, for the reason of which I mentioned, the special case of the pandemic. Now, food, the free food thing, I think was a brilliant idea. And as I kind of hinted, we are just in the process of completing research which will show that how important that free food was to in a sense, making sure that the lowest strata of society didn't suffer really very much because of that. Anyway, leaving that aside, so that food part of it, I think, was absolutely critical during the pandemic. Okay, so and it will naturally get phased out because you don't need it that much as we did during the pandemic. The fertilizer subsidy is tied up with the more important issue of agricultural reform more generally, and that's a tough subject. I doubt that the especially after the farmers' agitation, etc., that the government will tackle this thing because it really needs a lot of political preparation. But of course, the economic part of it is very, very clear. You know, any sensible agricultural economist will tell you that fertilizer is creating problems of land pollution, the fertilizer subsidy, land pollution, water pollution, and all kinds of overuse in crops, etc. And that really the best thing would be to replace it by a cash transfer, you know. So it's not a question of reducing what the farmers get, but giving it in a form which doesn't harm the environment. So instead of giving, let's say, 1,000 rupees per farmer through a fertilizer subsidy, it'd be much better to just hand it over as a cash subsidy to the farmer. But I don't think that at this point in time, the government is going to catch that bull by the horns. Unfortunately, the time is politically not right.
Well, after the farm laws debacle that we have seen, what should be the next idea that the government should be working on?
So there are three or four, three things in my view, which are kind of pending. One is tax reform. I think a lot of tax reform measures have been taken, the corporate tax, the GST introduction, but not complete simplification. So I think across the board, the direct tax code, greater simplification of the GST, simplification of customs duty, which is even more important now for MSMEs and for joining the supply chains because there's a huge opportunity. So tax reform is one. Number two is that some very important steps have been taken towards, for example, this cash transfer, which I mentioned, the farmers transfer, but a more comprehensive and integrated reform of the welfare system, I think is still to be done, which I hope will be done in the next 2 years. So these two, plus an easier one, but still a little bit of lagging, is the extension of the digital economy to rural areas. So a sharp step up in the connectivity, the digital connectivity, broadband connectivity will give huge benefits to the rural areas in my view. So these three things are on my agenda as being very important for productivity growth and GDP growth for the next decade, actually.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Virmani, for sharing all these wonderful insights with us right ahead of the union budget. It's just a matter of time when we will get to know what exactly makes to the final speech of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman in just a bit.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.